I'm going to introduce you.
Okay, I'll sit quietly.
Okay, we're back. I'm sorry so much for 15 minutes. At the next break, there will only be tea and berries, which you can pick with your fingers. The idea was that I was going to have strawberries, which is more appropriate, but it's not the season. They appropriately, Ontario ones will be here in July, I gather. But with the weather the way it is, my God, it might be September. Our next speaker is Douglas Sanderson, who is the visiting Indigenous scholar at the Redeemer. I've lost count. Maybe I'm hoping he has, and it might be his last year, but it might not. Douglas is the co-author of a book called Birdtail Valley of the Birdtail. It is a fantastic book. I try to focus because as one gets older, there's not as much room in there, Ontario. But this book is about a town next to a reserve in Manitoba. And it is brilliant. It took 5 years of research and heaven knows how long to write. It's won all kinds of awards, academic awards, and I highly recommend it. I was hoping he'd bring some to hawk to us, but did you? Oh, okay. Well, you can buy it online. Good Minds is the Indigenous bookstore. The Good Minds, all one word.com. That's where you buy in any Indigenous books, Indigenous topics, Indigenous writers. They're wonderful. They're in Brantford, and it's not far away, so you get your books darn quickly if they're in stock. Douglas belongs to the Opashwayak First Nation in Manitoba, and he teaches at my old school, the law school over here across the street. He's highly regarded academically. He's a wonderful person, and I ask you all to listen carefully and welcome him.
Hey, everybody. Whoa, that's loud. All right. Whew. I'll try and talk just at a normal level. Thanks so much for having me this morning. I'm sorry that I was a little late. I was in Hamilton this morning doing a talk on my book with a bunch of high school teachers, so that was really good news. And my co-author, Andrew Stobo-Snyderman, was supposed to join me in Hamilton, but he is a PhD student at Harvard University, and so he was not really sure he would actually be able to get back home if he joined us. So he was able to Zoom in, though, so that was nice, but, trouble in America is not far away. Thanks again for having me. My talk today is called Reconciliation is Nice, but What Happened to Justice? Nitikini-san Amo Banashi, Amiskni Dodem. My Cree name is Amo Banashi. It means hummingbird. My daughter made me this. And I'm from the Beaver clan of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. So as we heard already today, it's been nearly a decade since Canada's Royal Commission on Truth and Reconciliation issued their calls to action. And as we've heard, some progress in some places has been made. But what counts as progress? Consider the institution at which I have served for nearly 20 years, the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. Call to action number 28 was directed at law schools and says, We call upon law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So my faculty, just down the road over there, began in 2022 to require students to take a mandatory course in the first year of law school. There's a course that teaches about residential schools, the UN Declaration, treaties, Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, Aboriginal Crown relations. Now, you may be surprised to hear that ever since 2015, even for years and years before then, we taught in our first-year law program the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal and Crown relations. What we didn't do is teach all of that material in a single course. And Call to Action 28 is clear. Students must take a course that covers a checklist of materials. Merely covering all of those same topics spread out over other mandatory first-year courses was not technically in compliance with Call to Action 28. And I should say at the outset that for my part, I vigorously opposed a mandatory course in Aboriginal law. My belief was, and still is, that as long as we covered the required material, it didn't matter that we did it in a single course. And what's more, I believe that by not having a mandatory course, we were signaling to my law professor colleagues that it was incumbent upon them to learn the material and work it into their existing course areas. And that's what happened. Professors, young and old, took the TRC mandate to heart and started teaching Aboriginal and Indigenous law in basically every course that we taught at the Faculty of Law. We had to. It was incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we covered, at the very least, the required content of Call to Action 28. But then, over a series of committee meetings, my view was forced off the table. And indeed, it was actually Aboriginal students themselves who insisted on a single mandatory course, rejecting outright my view and the view of my co-chair that a holistic approach was to be preferred to a course in isolation. I was so upset by this, I actually offered my resignation as co-chair, and so did my co-chair, Mayo Moran, but our boss, the Dean of Law, instead asked that we carry on to implement the single course approach as demanded by our students and as set out in the stark language of Call to Action 28. So within 18 months, we had recruited the great Anishinaabe law scholar John Boros to join our faculty, and the mandatory course got underway. So problem solved. If anyone asks, has the U of T implemented Call to Action 28? We say, yes, absolutely. Mandatory course in the first-year program taught by the foremost scholar of Indigenous and Aboriginal law in the country. Tick, tick. Problem solved. But was that really the problem? I have been lucky enough in my life to know Senator and TRC Commissioner Justice Murray Sinclair. And over the years of his service in preparing the TRC report, I saw him age. I saw his physical strength wane, his health slip. I saw what happens to a person who sits and quietly listens to generations of residential school survivors talk about trauma, intergenerational trauma, violence, sexual violence, lateral violence, dark narratives of rape, even murder. And I watched a great man, as he found himself armed only with patience, thoughtfulness, and a drum, to take to the task of writing a national tragedy stretching from sea to sea to sea and across the generations. Now, when I looked at Call to Action 28, I thought, yeah, we should definitely teach that stuff. But is that what Murray Sinclair offered himself up for? Was all that pain and hurt and sorrow, all of that gathered up by one man, was all of that so that my students can tell you about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how the majority of the Supreme Court decided an Aboriginal rights case from 1998? Was that what it was really about? I don't think so. I believed that Senator, Commissioner, and Justice Murray Sinclair was calling for a revolution. He was calling us to change what law school looked like, so that Aboriginal students saw themselves and their cultures affirmed in the art that hung on the walls, so that non-Aboriginal students would be exposed to and normalize the sound of the drum in ceremony, and the smell of sage and sweetgrass in the classroom, that each and every professor in the Faculty of Law would embrace the challenge of teaching Aboriginal, Indigenous law and history in each of their respective course areas. All of that well beyond Call to Action 28. I believe that's what the Truth and Reconciliation had to be about. That was a goal for which Murray Sinclair might willingly sacrifice. But instead, we ticked the box. And one by one, my professorial colleagues stopped teaching, stopped learning about Aboriginal and Indigenous law and history, because they reasoned that all of that was now covered somewhere else in a mandatory course. We had, after all, ticked the box. And now, a few years later, as I reflect on that experience, I think about all the other institutions out there. The unions, the K-12 teachers, the government departments and police forces, the hospitals, the churches, city halls. Are they all ticking the boxes? In ticking the boxes, we lost an opportunity to interrogate for ourselves, each of us, in our own institutions. We lost the opportunity to reflect on reconciliation, to ask, what does reconciliation mean? And decide for ourselves how each of us would engage in that process. Instead, we gained the satisfaction of a box well ticked, a job well done, and the chance to look around and ask, why has nothing changed? Reconciliation is, as I have said, a noun and not a verb, and this means that you cannot actually do reconciliation any more than you can do potato. As a noun, reconciliation describes an end state, a vague description of future outcome, a reconciliation. But it's a reconciliation without addressing the heart and the root of the problem. I mean, let's face facts. The relationship between Aboriginal and settler citizens is not based in justice. It is not a just relationship. And we don't really need a detailed recitation of the facts on the ground. Canada's Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the justice system, particularly in our prison system. Aboriginal people are on the whole poorer and less educated, exposed to more violence, lack access to appropriate health care, attend underfunded schools, and deal with child welfare systems that, via the foster home system, has recreated the intergenerational trauma of the residential school system by forcibly seizing children such that today there are more Indian children in foster care than there ever were in residential schools. At the same time, Aboriginal people are, when compared to their settler neighbors, underrepresented in government and academia and the administration of justice, the lawyers, the police, the judges, the courts, and also in medicine and the corporate boardrooms. And from this, really only two conclusions can flow. Either Aboriginal people are stupid and lazy and addicted because of a genetic predisposition to poverty, or the system is broken. And Aboriginal people are victims of a system that is unjust in its distribution of wealth, authority, and access to power. Reconciliation is fine, but I want to talk about justice. Because without justice, reconciliation will only achieve the box ticking, not a just relationship. So let's go back to first principles and begin by answering a basic question. What is justice? Now, philosophers think about justice as comprising two distinct spheres: corrective justice, which addresses wrongs resulting from unfair transactions, and distributive justice, which deals with wrongs resulting from unfair allocations. And some examples will help clarify this distinction. Imagine my friend Adam wrongly steals Benita's lunch. Benita stores her lunch in the break room fridge in the morning, and before she returns for lunch, Adam comes in, decides he's hungry, sees Benita's lunch, helps himself. That's an example of injustice of the corrective kind. At its core, corrective justice addresses transactions. And here the transaction is Adam wrongly taking Benita's lunch and eating it. Adam is on this model of corrective justice one lunch up, while Benita is left one lunch short. So that's basically corrective justice. Some action or transaction wrongly benefits one party to the detriment of another. A simpler way even of thinking about this is to say that corrective justice aims to put people back into the position they would have been in had there been no injustice. If Adam pays Benita for the lunch he ate, then corrective justice says all is well. Everyone is back in the position they would have been in had the injustice not occurred. Now, distributive justice is different. Distributive wrongs occur when there's an unfairness in the allocation of things or resources. Now, imagine that Adam and Benita's boss, Connor, sees continuing fighting over lunches. Imagine that it's not just Adam and Benita, but there's a whole office staff of 20 people, and in the morning, some people put lunches in the fridge, and other people take lunches that don't belong to them and eat them. And since this is happening all the time, and since Connor is tired of trying to figure out who ate whose lunch, Connor decides to ban bringing lunch to work. The old system was unworkable. Connor announces, from now on, every member of the staff will contribute $4 a day to a pool, and Connor will take that money, buy food, and then at lunch hour, distribute a lunch to every member of the staff. At noon, each employee is handed a brown paper bag containing a sandwich and a bottle of water. But now imagine that the shortest members of the staff get 2 sandwiches, while everyone else gets just 1. Pretty soon, all but the shortest staff members are complaining to Connor, it's not fair. We all pay $4. We should all get the same number of sandwiches. Fairness in this context means that because everyone contributes the same amount, everyone should get the same distribution. And that's basically distributive justice. There's some thing to be apportioned for Connor, that's lunches, and some measure of determining how much each person gets. Everyone contributes the same, everyone should receive the same lunch. Once that distribution goes astray, once contributions no longer determine what you get, once some other factor has been introduced, say Connor's belief that short people just need more nutrition, then we have an unfair distribution. And to redress this wrong, to make the distribution right, we just need to allocate lunches in accordance with our measure of distribution. Everyone gets the same amount because everyone made the same contribution. So justice, in the abstract at least, is achieved by either addressing wrongs between the parties so that everyone's back into the position they would have been in, or when everything is distributed fairly. Thinking about injustice around lunches is relatively easy, but thinking about injustice in the relationship between Aboriginal and settler peoples is, of course, much more complicated. But I think that the way we think about the injustices suffered by First Nations can be made clearer once we figure out how to put our finger on what exactly the wrong is. What exactly are we trying to fix? And there is, I think, a general consensus that when we turn our minds to the relationship between First Nations and their settler neighbors, the wrong is easily made out. Settler government stole Indian land and redistributed that land to itself in the form of crown land, but also to non-Indian citizens and corporations. And to right that injustice, those lands need to be returned. A pretty straightforward case of corrective justice. So to make good this relationship, all that needs to happen is that the wrongdoer simply returns what was appropriated. And this view is aptly summarized in the catchy phrase, land back. Land was taken, land must be returned. Easy. But wait. What if we thought about an actual place, like, say, Toronto? Then I think we get a pretty rapid sense of why this is not so easy. Let's say, for the sake of simplicity, that the lands comprising the city of Toronto came into settler hands as a result of broken treaty promises, and indeed they had. Let's imagine the facts are perfectly clear, and they are. What do we do now? I think all of us living in Toronto, would be surprised to wake up to notices on our door announcing that to remedy a historic injustice, each of us needs to move on because this land is being returned to the Mississaugas of New Credit, who were the signatories of the Toronto Purchase and who were the victims of failed promises and broken treaties. Can millions of present-day Torontonians be made to leave their homes and neighborhoods to right a wrong committed by other people more than 150 years ago? Now, some Mississaugas of the New Credit members might well think, yeah, get off my land. But would a court ever make that order? Would any political party ever legislate that result? Absolutely not. So does this leave us with a wrong that we cannot in the present day remedy? Are we just stuck, foisted with the fact of wrongdoing and no way to make it right? We have been talking about the problem characterizing Aboriginal settler relations as though the problem was land that was taken. And so land is the thing that has to be returned. And that thinking has led us to this intractable problem of present-day Torontonians being ejected from their homes to atone for wrongs they themselves never committed. So let's step back again, try starting again from first principles. Now, property has certain characteristics, and no matter whether we're talking about cars or pencils or preferred share stocks, art or land, no matter what kind of property we are talking about, the central and most essential right of a property owner is the right to exclude others. It's hard to say you own a car if other people keep taking it on road trips without your permission. In other words, to have property is to have the right to exclude others from that property. And therein, I think, is the core of our problem. So long as we think about land as property, then giving land back to Indian people is giving Indian people the right to exclude others, because that's just what it is to have property in land. So it makes sense that when we talk about giving back the land, we invariably start thinking about how the current residents are going to have to leave. And this is, of course, a real problem. It's a problem for the 3 million people in Toronto who are aggrieved about being made to pay a price for something their ancestors did. And it's a problem for Indians because the hard reality is that no government is going to legislate an outcome that dislocates 3 million people. And no court will make an order to do so either. So we're stuck. Again. One way out of this mess is to reconsider our central claim that land was wrongly taken from Indigenous nations. If that's the wrong, then the only way forward is just to give the land back. And we've just agreed that that's a very unlikely outcome. So what if instead of thinking that land was taken, and so land must be returned, what if instead we imagined that what was wrongly taken from Indian nations was their right and capacity to live a good life as Indian peoples? Let me give you an example to more clearly make my point. Imagine that there is a farmer. Let's call him Farmer McLeod. And Farmer McLeod owns a farm that he inherited from his father, as did his father before him. Father McLeod's farm has fences and outbuildings and a big house, and he's connected to infrastructure like electricity and water. His kids attend the local school, and his wife, Mrs. McLeod, she works part-time in the town library, and they're members of the local grain cooperative. In short, the McLeods, like so many other landowners, are literally hooked into electrical and other infrastructure and embedded in a web of human and non-human relations. So now let's imagine that one day a bus arrives on the McLeod farm, and out steps Ottawa Bob, a senior civil servant from Ottawa. Bob explains that they're going to be doing some work, and the McLeods need to get on this bus, but they'll be returned tomorrow. And the McLeods comply. They get on the bus. Bus drives around, returns the next morning. Bus arrives back on the land of the McLeod family farm. But the land is empty now, completely empty. And as the McLeods step off the bus and the road itself just fade away into nothing. The McLeods look around and there's nothing there. No house, no fence, no town, no library, no grain co-op, no gas station, no roads, no cell towers, no electricity. It's all gone, scrubbed from the earth. Can we at this point look at the MacLeods and say, what are you crying about? You've got your land back, it's right there. Can we say that? I don't think we can. I think the MacLeods have a lot to cry about. I think what they had taken from them wasn't land. What was taken was their ability to live the good lives that they valued and once lived as farmers. There is an American philosopher named Jonathan Lear. And one day he found himself reading the biography of the Crow chief Plenty-Coup. Plenty-Coup regaled his biographer with amazing stories of adventure and war, leadership, sorrow and loss, love and fulfillment as a chief, as a warrior, as a Crow man. I should say, just as an aside, in Crow warrior society, the warriors carried these long sticks. It was known as a coup stick. And the highest honor that you could earn as a warrior in Crow society was not to kill your enemy, but to get close enough to them to strike them with the coup stick. That was called counting coup. Another way you could do it is, in battle, you could jam the coup stick into the ground, which was your signal to your enemy that this far and no further. The coup stick is a highly symbolic part of Crow life. So there Plenty-Coup is. He's telling stories about his coup stick, his many, many victories in war. But when it came to the biographer's questions about Plenty-Coup's life after he left his nation and they were moved onto a reservation, Plenty-Coup said, "You know that part of my story as well as anyone. You tell what happened." And the biographer did know about Plenty-Coup's life after moving to the reservation. There, while living on the reserve, Plenty-Coup had grandchildren whom he deeply loved, and Plenty-Coup became not just a farmer, but a prize-winning farmer. In 1932, Plenty-Coup represented Indian nations at the dedication for the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington, Virginia, and while there, as the only Aboriginal representative, Plenty-Coup gave a speech in the Crow language to honor the unknown soldier, and then laid on the casket his war bonnet and coup stick. And they remain there to this day. But Plenty-Coup wouldn't talk about any of this, wouldn't talk about any part of his life after they moved to the reservation. And the biographer persisted again and again. You know, we just sort of assume that people have a preeminence about their own story. Plenty-Coup should be the one who tells his story about his life on the reserve. And one day, after a long pause, after being asked again and again to tell about his life on the reserve, Plenty-Coup said, "After we were moved to the reservation, our hearts fell to the ground, and we could not pick them up again. After that, nothing happened." Our hearts fell to the ground, and we could not pick them up again, and after that, nothing happened. Plenty-Coup's whole world was taken from him when he was moved to a reservation. Everything that gave his life meaning, everything that made it possible for him to live a good life as a Crow Nation chief, all of that was taken from him. Plenty-Coup and the MacLeods, they should probably talk. They have a lot in common. So I think it makes sense to think about what Indian nations lost wasn't land, though land is part of the package. I was giving a talk similar to this at the university a few weeks ago, and I was saying, "It's not about the land, it's not about the land." And then my colleague Susan Hill got up and said, "Except that sometimes it is about the land." And, and I think what she meant was, when I'm talking about the land, I'm talking about the control over the land. But she's talking about the physical presence of indigenous peoples on the land. So I try and bear in mind that sometimes it is about the land. So a truer measure of the loss suffered by indigenous nations includes losing the ability to live a good life in a particularly indigenous kind of way. What does that mean? Well, for Farmer McLeod, institutions like local governance and public schools and roads and a market for grain, these are the things that make it possible for the McLeods to live good lives as farmers in a modern Canadian state. Now, for people indigenous to these lands, I think that the kinds of institutions that support that conception of the good life might include things like thinking about Indian families in terms of clan identity instead of as nuclear families. It would include the cultural capacity to speak our own languages. It would include access to traditional foods and medicines, and education and governance systems that make these institutions possible. The philosopher John Rawls advanced a vision of political liberalism around which much of contemporary political philosophy is based. And one of the key points that Rawls makes is that the distribution of goods and resources in a society has to include institutions that positively affirm our distinctive conception of what it is to live a good life. Because we believe that healthcare is a universal human right, everyone gets access to healthcare. Because we believe that university admissions should be based on accepting those with the best chances of succeeding, we have a merit-based admission system. Institutions like healthcare and universities are institutions that reflect and affirm positively the shared values of a modern liberal state like Canada. Now, let me gather together some of the threads here. Canada committed an injustice against First Nations people. The government took from them, from Indigenous peoples, the capacity to live lives that mattered to Indigenous people as Indigenous people. And to right that wrong, Canada must help to rebuild and affirm institutions that affirm a First Nations conception of what it is to live a good life. That might mean schools in First Nations communities with lots of learning on the land. An appreciation for traditional medicine and their integration with that of settler hospital systems. And maybe a child welfare system that was centered on clan identity rather than on nuclear families. Now, we might also think about this injustice a second way. We might think about it from the position of distributive justice. We might stipulate, we might say, like, let's just imagine that no injustice ever happened. Or maybe we'll say, how can we think about justice without regard to past wrongs? Because it's too messy to sort those out. And so we would ask, what would be a fair distribution of institutions that affirm the identities of Canada's three founding nations? I think it's reasonable to say that in English Canada, the institutions that affirm English Canadian values abound. They're all around us. Within that, there's room for immigrant values that align quite broadly with English norms. So for example, we might ask, is there room for cultures that believe families should live intergenerationally rather than family residence consisting of just parents and children or no children at all? And so, yes, the norms of English Canada can accommodate intergenerational families through the construction of larger homes. And we might ask the Quebecois, does the current structure of Canada accommodate French-Canadian cultural values? And I think, broadly speaking, the answer is yes. The Quebecois value their distinctive language and culture, and Quebec has a variety of tools to protect this distinct Quebecois society. But what of First Nations? Does the current Canadian justice or child welfare system positively affirm the values of Indigenous peoples? Do public schools affirm a vibrant place for Aboriginal histories and cultures? Does the current distribution of lands and resources make it possible for Aboriginal people to live good and valuable lives pursuing distinctly Indigenous conceptions of the good life? And here the answer is no. The current distribution of resources dedicating to affirming our public and private values skews heavily to English and French Canada, with very little in the way left over for Aboriginal ways of being and doing. The relationship between Aboriginal and settler Canada on the corrective or the distributive justice accounts produce the same diagnoses. Aboriginal people no longer have the resources or political jurisdiction to build and maintain Aboriginal affirming institutions. So how do we remedy that injustice? I think it's important to understand that communities living under the Indian Act, Indian reserves, are self-governing in some ways, but not in the most important way. First Nations governments have little to no powers of taxation and very little land over which to govern. The collective land mass of Indian reserves in Canada, if you added them all up together, put them all together into one, they equate to 0.05% of the nation's land mass. There are 100 times more land in Canada's national parks than there are in all of the Indian reserves put together. So very tiny little splotches of land. Tiny territories combined with no power to raise money from activities on the land means that Indian governments are wholly dependent on transfer payments from the federal government. If you've ever wondered why do reserves lack clean running water or have moldy homes, it's because those communities cannot raise the money to fix those problems. They subsist on federal transfer payments. Imagine if you lived in Toronto but could not raise money to fix potholes or buy library books or pay teacher salaries. That is the condition in which Indian reserve communities live. If you ask for money to fix the water treatment plant and someone says no, it just doesn't happen. First Nation people, if we are serious, are going to need more land over to which to exercise new powers of taxation. Taxing wages, taxing resource extraction, taxing financial institutions within an enlarged territory, and then spending that money on things like teacher salaries and water treatment plants, or new and appropriate housing for community members. Oftentimes, when we look at the problems with Indigenous communities, there's just so many. So many things are broken. It's just like, where do we begin? How do we even do that? And I don't think it's up to us to figure that out. I'm 100% sure that if those communities are sufficiently resourced, they'll build good schools for their children. They'll find a way to fix the water treatment plant. They'll have a decent child welfare system. The problem is not that we haven't figured out how to fix those things. It's that we haven't figured out how to adequately resource those communities. Now, in a way, we're just kind of back at the land back problem, though. Remember, the problem with focusing on land taken from Indian nations is that land is a kind of property, and property means the right to exclude others. So to return land to Indian nations is to ask everyone else to leave. But this is only a problem if we continue to talk about the problem as one of property. Instead of property, we could think about territory. And the difference between property and territory is that the former means the right to exclude, where territory is just the reach of a government, the physical extent of a government's reach. So think about Northern Ontario. There you'll find 43 communities with no road access to the south. They are fly-in communities only, and they are tiny. And all around them is Crown land, miles and miles and miles of square miles of Crown land. And so even though there's no sign of provincial government presence, the land is still controlled by civil servants in Toronto. And it's civil servants in Toronto who decide who gets to mine, who gets to extract timber, who gets to build dams and wind farms. And with these projects, the province of Ontario extracts from resource companies the wealth of the North via taxes and stumpage fees and royalties. Stumpage fees alone, money paid Ontario for the privilege of cutting down trees. Stumpage fees amount to almost $1 billion a year of revenue of Ontario's economy each and every year. So what if instead of Ontario, those 43 First Nations got together and created one governing body that could decide who gets to extract what resources and at what cost, with the First Nations themselves receiving the payments? To the extent that there are private landowners in these new First Nation territories, those landowners would keep title to their land. Because again, we're not talking about transferring property. We're just talking about which level of government is the one that controls what happens. So if you were a landowner within one of these newly created Aboriginal territories, the only change to your life would be that you would pay your tax money to a different order of government, and they would arrange your garbage pickup. They would staff your school. But no one has to leave on this model. The mistake is thinking about property, and the right move is to think about territory and a robust third order of government with jurisdiction over territory large enough not merely to sustain First Nations communities, but to see those communities flourish. As long as we think of what was taken from Indian nations was land, then excluding others is the only way to actually effect that remedy. But when we think about what was taken as something more like governing powers and institutions that support Indigenous ways of being, then we don't need to ask anyone to leave. Settler residents of newly First Nations governed territory would not have to give up their land. Instead, they would pay their property and maybe some of their income tax to local First Nations governments that would maintain the roads and the schools and pick up the garbage and do all the other mundane things that make up the background work of modern governments. Reconciliation is fine. It's maybe even a necessary step to achieving broader goals. But for me, that end goal is justice. It must be. And to get there, we need to do more than reconcile. We need to begin talking about fundamental structural changes and a fair distribution of wealth and political power in a Canada that is committed to justice for Aboriginal peoples. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Tim.